Hello and welcome to this special episode of Great Things with Great Tech. This is actually episode 13. My name is Anthony Spiteri and this podcast is all about highlighting companies doing great things with great tech. And in this episode, I'm talking to Niraj Tolia, President, GM and co-founder of Kasten. Welcome to the show, Niraj.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. Excited to be here. We've been talking for a while, but excited about talking to your audience here today too.
Yeah, this is excellent. I'm looking really forward to diving into the Kasten story. But just before that, it's been a while. It's been about a month between shows. So if you love great things with great tech and you'd like to feature on future episodes, you can go to launch.gtwgt.com and register interest. Actually, we've got all the episodes locked in for the rest of the year, which is really exciting for me. So some really good things to come. So we're taking bookings for 2021. 2021 is looking up in all aspects, right? So yeah, this is great. And just another reminder, these shows are available on YouTube and all great podcasting platforms. So if you're new to it, please register, please subscribe, just to catch up with past episodes and all the future episodes. So with that out of the way, again, I mentioned this is a special episode because, you know, Kasten is now part of the Veeam family. And you know, I wanted to chat to Niraj to talk about Kasten, the story, because it's a great story. And then, you know, talk a bit about the space that Kasten is in, that Kasten has seen the addressable market for, because it's an interesting one. And it's one that traditional IT op guys like myself kind of struggle with, but we're starting to be pulled into it. Niraj, I've heard you talk about data gravity before. I sort of think Kubernetes has got a gravity of its own, but yeah, let's kick into it, right? So a little bit of history and facts first. So Kasten was founded in 2017, so not that long ago, based out of Los Altos in California. And Niraj, you co-founded it in 2017. Did you want to just talk a little bit about what led up to that co-founding and how you got there with your co-founder?
Sure. You know, like all good startup stories go, this came out of pain for us. So to rewind the clock a little bit behind, we started in very early 2017, but we got involved with Kubernetes in the pre 1.0 days. So I think my first exposure to Kubernetes was in 2015 or so. Okay. At that point in time, I used to work for a large company, EMC, that Dell acquired down the line. And we started facing pain and complaints from our developers, right? And why? It wasn't the obvious reasons. It was because we had adopted Kubernetes as a platform for something new that we were building. And developers started complaining about integration problems early on in the process versus, you know, when you're moving into production or when things come together later. So on one hand, we had pain, but we were discovering and fixing problems earlier. That's when the first light bulb went off for us that, hey, there's something behind this whole container thing. Hey, Docker was new. There was Mesosphere running around. But we said, there's something about this Kubernetes thing. So that was the first thing. Then the second thing was, even though we were just hosting a SaaS platform on top of Kubernetes, what happened was that when we tried to run stateful services, it was extremely cumbersome in this environment. Data protection was non-existent. Yeah. It was just hard to do anything meaningful with stateful applications there. So that was the pain that we felt, right? A couple of years down the line, I left EMC, took a few months off, and, you know, I kept on coming back to this Kubernetes journey that we faced. We thought others would face it too. And, you know, we knew the problems as more meaningful applications were launched on the platform, problems enterprises would face. So that's how we got into the business of helping enterprises protect their stateful applications running on this platform.
Interesting. You mentioned 2015. I can think back then when I was first playing with, you know, what was containerization at the time, Docker. My biggest goal was just downloading it to my MacBook, which I've still got sitting right there. I think I've actually got the original binaries that I downloaded on it. And my biggest thing was trying to run Doom at the time, you know, trying to get a VNC connection to Doom to run Kubernetes. But no. I mean, I was looking at running, you know, WordPress and all that kind of stuff, which ironically still today seems like one of some of the biggest first step use cases when you deploy Kubernetes. Instead of, you know, get nodes, you want to just basically deploy a WordPress application to see what it can do. But I think I just wanted to highlight at the time, like, it was so raw but you saw something in it, right, that has driven you to this point. And that's really, you know, kudos to yourself, but also I think that stems from your background. So before we talk a little bit more about Kasten and how it progressed through the years, you've got a strong tech background, right, in distributed systems, storage, data management, and you mentioned your Dell EMC days, but you've worked for a number of different companies, and you got a PhD as well. Did you want to just talk a little bit about your?
I don't admit
background?
to that one too much in public, but yes,
you're a doctor.
Yes, technically, right? Never raised my hand on an airplane, but in all seriousness, this PhD is one of those things I accidentally lucked myself into, where coming out of undergrad, as we call it in the US, and right, so I was finishing up my bachelor's in computer engineering and computer science. And when looking at most jobs out there, I was like, yes, they're interesting, but is there something else to do? And so that's one of the reasons why I decided to spend a few more years in college or university and focus on getting a PhD. And this is one of these funny things where this was the first time when I was moving into graduate school. I had some storage experience as an undergrad. And I said, I do not want to work on storage systems for my PhD. Lo and behold, that's what I spent the next 4 to 5 years doing. Right? Yeah. So I went to Carnegie Mellon here in the US, great advisor, had worked on distributed file systems, great set of fellow PhD students in the cohort I learned a lot from. So overall, amazing experience. Then spent a few years at HP Labs, working on next generation data centers. Okay. Again, I started by saying, don't want to work on storage systems. But, guess what, I landed up working on that. And since then, I've decided this is my home, this is my community. Yeah. I'm never going to get away from it.
Yeah. There's an Al Pacino quote in there, right? Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. That sounds like you in storage.
Data has gravity, right?
Yeah, that's it. So that all that has led you to working around storage, working in and around it, and then like you mentioned before in the start of Kasten, really saw the space for the data protection of those containerization workloads, those microservices. Distributed systems, because there's a different way of that working than what traditionally you would have in physical service to virtual. The containerization space just fundamentally shifted the way that applications were developed. So how did you see that, before we get into the specific history, how did you see that transition from what was traditional in the virtualization wave, which changed the game as well, but effectively we're still running, I don't like saying it, monolithic workloads, monolithic applications, traditional applications within a VM. They were easier to scale up and down because you had the virtual construct. So where else you had one physical server, you waited to get it to scale up. You could scale up a web server very quickly. In fact, that's something that I worked on when I was younger, trying to kind of deploy our websites. How do we scale it? Well, we just deploy another VM, put on MySQL, that sort of thing. But this took it to the next level. So how were those early days, and how did you see the transition? And it's still transitioning, but how did you see that transition and where it's going?
So I think some of the things that helped us, or rather gave us confidence to embark on this journey of founding a startup, extremely scary, let me tell you that as an aside. But one of the things that helped convince us that this was going to be worth the next 10 years of our life, me and Webb, my co-founder, was that when we went to the early DockerCons, KubeCons, even adjacencies like a Cloud Foundry Summit, we saw a bottoms-up movement, the grounds-up movement, where developers were coming and saying, this is what we want to use because it makes our life so easy. And these were bleeding-edge adopters, let's be clear on that one. And we're very brave people. And we saw them coming from, quote unquote, boring or more conservative industries.
Interesting.
Because it was manufacturing, it was pharma, it was finance, financial services. So when we looked at that across the spectrum, we're like, there has to be something here that's worth your digging into.
Yeah.
Those are some of the things that convinced us.
Yeah, right. So in 2017, in January, this is a very, very quick history, right? Founded by yourself and Vaibhav Karma. I think I've butchered his first name, but it was close enough maybe. And then it took, Crunchbase told me that it took you until March 2017 to get your first seed, which was I think about 3 million US. So that must have been pretty exciting at the time. So how many people were at the company to start with?
So on day one, we had 5 people. So it was me, my co-founder, Vaibhav, and then 3 other people that we've been working with still at the company.
Yeah.
But I think some of them I'm technically now at my 5th or 6th company with.
Okay.
Right,
okay. So you had a
together.
core group, and that's actually interesting. Let's tap into that a little bit, because I think that's always how these sort of startups, a lot of them start with. There's a group of people that you've worked with for a number of times. You identify not only, I guess, the talent that they have, but also the willingness and the cohesion as a unit to work as a company. And I know that Kasten has a very strong culture. I've heard you talk about that before. So that must have been a really good foundation for the company in terms of just getting a group of people that believe together and that could work together culturally. Just maybe comment on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I am honored and fortunate to put their trust in me. We've all been through startups, large companies together, been through that journey. But I think it's taking that initial leap of faith. It's the first few people that are both the hardest and the most important. Because at the end of the day, founders guide a company, but it's never command and control. You can't dictate what it's going to be. But the right set of people that want the culture, right? And that's the other thing. Before we were founded, we had, on the day one, we were 5 people that were founded, and we had our culture defined. That is, this is who we want to be when we grow up as a company. Forget about the product and technology, very exciting. But as a company, who do we want to be when we grow up? We had defined that. And it is this set of people that help carry it forward. Great culture was an extremely effective tool for us to outcompete others in the market.
Yeah, and I think foreshadowing a little bit as well. The end up, the acquisition and the merging with Veeam has a similar sort of culture, right? So I think that's very pointed. Is that you saw some synergies there with the culture, which obviously helped a little bit. But moving forward, so a couple of years went past, and then. I think I think in about early 2018 was when you came on my radar. But then in August of 2019, actually, funnily enough, that's when we actually first met at VMworld last year. It seems like a lifetime ago. We had a brief little meeting during the party, and you said, "Hey, if you're in, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, come and say hello." And I was like, "Well, I'm never going to be there." Ended up being that a couple of months later, myself and Michael K came and visited you in the office. Which was an amazing experience for me to be able to see a startup. Again, I've seen a couple, just to see that engine room, the developers there coding, looking really tired, but also the great food that you had. It just was really exactly what you expect of a startup, and so that was fantastic to see. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be there. But I think what I gathered from the conversation that we had that day is that you were so passionate about Kasten, you were passionate about what you were doing, and you believed in the direction that the company was going. So, in 2019, you got a Series A funding from Insight Partners, which kind of kicked you along. And I guess that all, just revving it up very quickly, took you to October 2020, where, you were acquired by Veeam for 150 mil of cash and stock. It's an amazing story to get you from 2017 to 2020 in acquisition. So number one, how did that feel at the time? And number two, why did you end up doing that, making that step to get acquired? I mean, I'm always interested in that, because I see 2 trajectories in this, especially for a company that's so young. And I know that in Silicon Valley today, that people want to sort of, before acquisitions or before events, before IPOs, that's taking longer. So to go and turn that around in 4 years was quite interesting. So maybe just give a little bit of, color around that.
So it's a very good point. And, as with all founders that have invested sweat, blood, engineering into a company, it's never an easy decision to make at the end of the day. But, we had other options on the table. We could have gone, raised a Series B. Insight was very supportive of us. We could have gone, taken that to the next stage. And the things that broke in favor were, and this boils down to culture again, when we look at it. When we had actually announced a partnership with Veeam acquiring company a few months before the acquisition took place. And it's not just senior leadership at Veeam, but everyone across the board, people on the ground, people working with customers. It was just an amazing set of people to work with. So there was no hesitancy on that part. We are also being run independently.
Yes.
And allowed to, and being supported actively in trying to run as fast as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing and then, right, the third part of it is obviously, right, from the entire company's perspective, right? All the investors generally make out fine, right? No matter what in most startups.
Yeah.
But from the company's perspective, from the team's perspective, that's also something we cared a lot about. We have folks in the company that have never been through a startup exit, and this was very meaningful to them. So yes, we could have, always rolled the dice and said, hey, let's look at what happens 3-4 years from now. But for the group as a whole, for the investors, for our future in terms of what we can do with the power of Veeam behind us, I think all of those pointed to what was ultimately an obvious answer.
Yeah, and that's good. And look, I'm personally glad that you guys agreed to do that, right, and went through that process, because it's opened up a whole new world for myself and for others in the team, and we're all excited. Not that we, doubted the Kubernetes space and the containerization space before, but this is a bit of a validation around that. And let's now take the second half of this and talk about that K word, right, which is, there's a bit of hype around it. It's there, it's not there. I think depending on where you are in the world, where you sit in IT, ops, DevOps, it can mean different things, and it's intrinsically different, right? One story that I found really interesting, right, is I was flying back from an AWS reInvent. I think it was 2018, and I sat next to a guy, and we got talking, and he was at the summit, and I was like, okay, what do you do? And he said, I work in front-end web hosting, I develop and all this kind of stuff. And I said, okay, so what do you run it on? You run it on VMware, Hyper-V, what platform? And he said, I've not really heard of VMware. What's that? And I kind of went, what do you mean? Like, you're joking, right? But he was dead serious. He had not ever heard really of. He was born, and he wasn't young. He wasn't like out of college. He was quite around my age, so not young, not old, but kind of in that middle spot. But his whole world was living in containerization, application development, front-end, Nginx deployments, that sort of thing. He didn't care about anything else underneath. He just basically deployed on top of all that infrastructure. And that was a real moment for me when I realized that there is another world out there which I honestly need to know more about. And Kubernetes and container backup in general is certainly where it starts. So what would you say to that? I mean, infrastructure traditionally, there's two sides of it. It's trying to come together, but there is this sense of people that are born cloud native. What do you reckon about that?
So it's a very interesting thing you talk about, right? First of all, fundamentally, right, I am obviously biased, but it's my belief that Kubernetes is the next way of infrastructure. The one before that was VMware that you spoke about.
Yeah.
The next way of infrastructure is going to be Kubernetes. And as much buzz as there is in this ecosystem today, I think 3 years from now, we're going to look back at today with similar notions of that 2020 was the early days, because a lot of our growth is in front of us.
Yeah.
But what you raise is something very critical, that there are the people, including developers, ops, etc., that were born in the cloud. But something that we also focus a lot on, and that I personally also think a lot about, is how do we bring along the set of people that have been working on OpenStack or vSphere or on-prem stuff to this cloud native world? And how does one bridge that? Because there are people that have the training, because Kubernetes or containers might have been the first thing they saw as they started their professional career. But there's a much wider body of people out there that I want to bring along with us as we get to this space. And it's not just about the technology here, right? As you very well know, the hardest thing about technology sometimes is the people. And how do we make folks successful in this environment, I think, is what we as a community need to think more about.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned a funny, interesting point that a lot of people coming out of uni or doing whatever they're doing out of college, Kubernetes and containerization is all they know. And I shouldn't laugh at that too much, because I think about even some of the people that I work with, where their first, machine was a virtual machine. They had no idea of the physical construct. They never looked at a storage array. They never looked at a physical server. Their first machine was a virtual machine. So it's not too fanciful to think that, this is the way it goes. And when you think about it in that way, it's logical, right? But obviously to that end, virtual machines aren't going away. Physical machines aren't going away because you still need something to run those virtuals, which then in turn might run the containers. And that's where I think, the future is set, that very hybrid platform. But the key there is that you've got these microservices, you've got these cloud native applications, which intrinsically become portable, right? And mobile. That's the key. And that's really where the value of containerization and then Kubernetes as a management platform on top of that comes into play, right?
So, right.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, right? There is obviously, I think what you hit upon is right. There's a spectrum of things that are going to exist. And it's like we keep on adding like another layer of abstraction on top.
Yeah.
Where Kubernetes, but 90% of the world's or more of the world's Kubernetes deployments run on VMs that ultimately run physical servers. And at some point in time, there'll be something that abstracts Kubernetes away. And I think that's okay.
Yeah.
Because this is the fundamental building block of what new things look like. And it's about how do we make, right? I'm an infrastructure person. That's my lifeblood. That's what I enjoy working on.
Yeah.
But the people on top that bring ultimate value to customers, consumers, etc., the folks building the real applications out there, they look at it very differently. Today, when we speak to people and we ask them, what storage do you use? Right? Half the time, we don't get back a NetApp or Pure Storage or something along those lines. We hear MySQL and Cassandra.
Oh, yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah. A level up. That's an abstraction on top of it. Yeah.
That's an abstraction, but that's what people now think of as storage.
Interesting.
Right? The app developer, and they are the power brokers in this new world we live in.
Yeah.
Not the infrastructure vendors, not the IT people, it's the developers.
Yeah. That's really interesting because it's true. Like for a dev, storage is relative to where they put their data. And their data is being put into a database, traditional or, distributed, no SQL, that sort of thing. That's actually a really interesting point. I never thought of it that way, where storage can be considered that level, because I always, like you, probably thought storage is, that hard sort of disk that sits there. More recently, we've had that kind of disrupted a bit by putting layers on top of it. So you put like maybe a software layer on top of a hardware, distribute it and do something like that. But there's even a layer above that. And that's interesting. That comes back to the mobility and portability piece, right? And we've been trying to do that. It's existed in the IT world for ages. I think of when I was a very much failed computer science delegate at university, which I didn't pass, but it gave me a bit of a start. And we were working on Java applications. And that was the idea about Java, right? The portability to go cross-platform. I remember working on JBoss servers, which effectively meant you could run these Java apps and effectively run them everywhere. That's just evolved, hasn't it, really? And that's where kind of Kubernetes and containerization is today. A little bit better. To say it's a little bit better version of Java is obviously not giving it the credit it deserves. But the mentality, the theory behind it is pretty much the same.
Yeah. No, I would agree, right? There's some people in the audience that are probably too young to remember Sun's marketing slogans around write once, run anywhere with Java. But some of that is coming true. But what is impressive is what Kubernetes that come true for infrastructure, not just for app code. You define your load balancer, your ingress, or your network policy. It doesn't matter if you're running on-prem with vSphere or OpenStack or in a public cloud or an AWS's managed Kubernetes cluster. It translates into the infrastructure you're working on. So we have customers that are in 3 different public clouds. And, let's be honest, no one's moving around workloads between clouds on an hourly basis.
Yeah.
Not today. I don't think for the next 3 years.
It's been a promise for a long time, but it's people like, that gravity that we're talking about. And everyone wants to be sticky to a certain extent, it's too much hassle. So the concept's amazing, but it's there. But yeah, go ahead. I think I know where you're leading with this.
Yeah, but we see it is multi-cloud, even though people will say, hey, it's a marketing thing by a second-tier cloud that wants to come in, etc., or the second-place cloud. It's really not that. There are real problems people are facing, whether companies have come in through acquisition, whether a company has their own external customers that have different choices. Sometimes it's late binding based on cost, short-lived properties. We see such a wide spectrum of multi-cloud use.
Yeah.
And Kubernetes has made it possible for what used to take 10, 15 people to potentially just 1, 2 people managing environments spread across globally, right? Across multiple clouds, multiple regions. And it is extremely powerful because of things like that.
Yeah. And you know what? I've kind of come to that realization more recently. I've been obviously dabbling on it for a long time and, not really understanding it, kind of doing what I think 90% of people do in our world, which is, maybe, follow a blog site, run up a small Kubernetes cluster, do micro KS, whatever it is, type in kube control, get nodes and kind of go, yep, there we go. I'm happy. I've run it. Because what do you do after that, right? It's up. It's good. What do you do next? But more recently, I've dived in, and actually, to be fair, it's VMware's Tanzu. It's really got me into it, right? Which I think is telling, right? Because the strategy that VMware have been to bridge the DevOps and the traditional infrastructure with this platform, and have Kubernetes running Kubernetes, which is, and I only really got the concept of that really in the last couple of weeks by doing and seeing it, and working out then how you deploy the guest clusters, how you do the ingress, how you do the load balancing, all that sort of stuff was very foreign as a concept, because I traditionally, and I'm a web hoster guy, I'm a service provider guy. It shouldn't have been that foreign to me, but I struggled with it until I literally got to see what it was doing. And let's not mention the storage and the statefulness and the storage infrastructure. That's even taking it a step level in terms of understanding, right, and how you get that statefulness in there. But that said, that's where I think Kubernetes and the backup space can move forward and has moved forward. So let's just go the last little bit talking about Kubernetes and backups, because I think for the longest time, and even today, people will go, why backup Kubernetes? Why backup containers? Why? Why do you want to do it? It's not how it is. It should be all architected in the application. If the application is highly available, why do you need backups? And I actually asked that question to a few people. I remember in 2018 at AWS reInvent, going around to some of those early sort of cloud native, Kubernetes sort of platforms, and asked them, how do we back you guys up? And they said, why? I was like, well, I guess at some point someone wants to back up the data, or maybe even the config and what it is to actually run this application. So how does Kasten deal with that in terms of backing up a Kubernetes application?
So it's a great question. I think we'll talk about how we do it in a second, but something I would like to point out, especially for people that are new or were born in the cloud, right? We have run into misconceptions where people running Kubernetes will say, hey, I have my data replicated across 3 regions and I'm okay that way. I'm like, no, you drop a table on a database here, it'll replicate at the speed of light to all the other regions. So replication is not backup, is the one thing sometimes light bulb goes off. Or sometimes they just assume that, hey, I'm running a public cloud, my infrastructure will never fail. No, you look at AWS and the EBS PMs will tell you annual failure rate is not 0. It's low, but it's not 0.
Yeah.
So these are things one always needs to think about no matter what environment you're running in. But what we discovered when we started Kasten was, right, and as I said, all my history working for companies has been on the infrastructure side of things.
Yeah.
And a very meaningful realization came about to us that is, it might seem subtle, but impacted everything that we did, was that we could not approach it with an infrastructure point of view. We had to understand the application. So what that meant, when we back something up today, we don't just back up data, we back up your entire application. Helps in portability that you just spoke about. But that means we understand security policies, networking configuration, secrets, application config, service accounts, all these things that one would SSL certificates and when to regenerate them. So all these things that people wouldn't normally think about when they think backup is what we did. So how do you really figure out at runtime what an application is? And there's been 100x explosion, right? We see applications with 600, 700 distinct components that we protect.
Wow, yeah.
So
it's a lot of moving parts, right? And you have to be aware. Is there a word for that? Is there a?
So, well, I don't even know for that scale, right? People call it a microservices architecture, but I really do think we need a new word for a Kubernetes native architecture or something, because of just the objects that get materialized in different ways.
Yeah.
But that leads to significant challenges. And, so the short answer is we do it carefully. But in reality, it's about being extremely dynamic, following the same philosophy that Kubernetes does, being declarative, saying, I want to back something up. I don't know what it's going to look like 5 minutes from now, an hour from now, a day from now, but I need to back this up according to this policy. So then how do we bridge that gap between intent and what needs to execute is what we spend quality time working on.
And to that end, you guys have done that through effectively, K10 K10 is the application. It's your product that you guys release. I can see the very smart marketing on that jacket there in terms of the Kasten and K10. That's it. Always goes the other way. Actually, side note, never talked about this. What does Kasten mean? Where did you get the name?
So Kasten's a German word. Right? So every time we speak to German customers, they laugh because they know from the first meeting. It's a German word that means container.
Well, there you go.
It was quite apropos in terms of when we came across the name. The domain was obviously available, so it just worked out.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's actually a great story. Going in container, it kind of makes sense. And it would be interesting talking to the German guys. They'd be going, we know what you do, no worries. So going back to K10. So K10 is deployed as a Kubernetes application, right? So it sits there. It's got its own services. It's got its own pods. It all comes together. You can ingress the dashboard. You can load balance it if you want. You can do different levels of authentication to get into it. And it's got its own I think you use Prometheus. It's got all the bits and pieces for doing a Kubernetes application. So it's almost like it's a bit of inception, right? Where you can deploy this as easy as pie. And when I say easy, depending on how you're, in my experience recently, if you're doing it on-prem, not so easy. If you're doing it in the public clouds through marketplaces, really easy. But you can effectively have it up and running within a couple of minutes, right? And that's the beauty of it. And then it basically goes in, it looks at the Kubernetes infrastructure that you have, it looks at any deployments that you've got, it then tells you if it's got a policy attached or not. You can then create a basic policy to take a snapshot or take it off to an offsite backup. So it's really got the building blocks of a traditional backup system, but deployed in a cloud native way. And that's obviously helped you guys get a fair understanding about what you need to back up itself, isn't it? And how you protect that. So maybe just talk a little bit about how you came into having it deployed in that way, because it obviously needed to be that way if you're going to succeed in this industry, right?
Yep. So I think this is one of the things. It was something we knew. Kubernetes is complex. We've touched upon it multiple times in this conversation. And we knew that upfront before we started the company, and day one, right? The goal was how do we make this as easy to use as possible, right? Scale is another thing, being able to run from laptop to multi-100 node clusters, the same system. But how easy do we make it? And I think the best couple of points of evidence we received is from customers where either they've done a bake-off where they tried to use a legacy product to protect the containers, and one team was done in literally 20-25 minutes, right? Nuts to bolts. The other team, 2.5 hours later, was trying to still poke holes in a firewall to get something else to work. And this is just one of these things where you need to be deeply integrated in the system. You need to be where the data is, where the applications are. You need to not weaken security in this ransomware rich or with such a large attack surface out there. And in all of the scenarios, when we really focused on ease of use, being application centric, and delivering value to customers, right? So goal is we should be up and running in a public cloud or on-prem in 5 minutes or less. Obviously on-prem, there's few more oddities that you'll run into in terms of networking in particular. But that's a goal. And that's how we really, really work hard on that. That's why literally day one, the first hire was a UX person.
There you go.
Or an infrastructure company.
So how does Kubernetes as a management platform impact the concept of backups? I mean, we've talked a little bit about that, but how does Kubernetes itself impact that?
So I think the requirements have changed because you need in terms of, let's talk about user requirements. Today, we don't get people asking us for, give me backup. It's about, give me self-service. Give me very fine-grained security. I want the same thing Kubernetes does. You talked about Prometheus, but we spend a lot of time on doing what we call ecosystem integration. So we transparently insert into someone's workflow. They'll be using Prometheus and Grafana to monitor, using Splunk to audit as an example, or some other third-party system. How do you transparently plug into this entire ecosystem? Your console for Red Hat OpenShift if they're using it. So when you talk about backup in this environment, it becomes the requirements from a backup platform have significantly changed. Where operators are not saying, I need to do backup. They're like, I need to provide backup to the 600 developers or 1,000 developers that are running. Give them self-service to restore, do it securely, make sure the business is in compliance. I, as an operator, might be responsible for keeping the lights on, but the developers are figuring out what the policies are when they restore, when they clone, things of that nature. And doing this at the application level, because right, no one's going to think about for a single app, these are my 700 components, and then multiply that across by 100 or by 500.
Yeah.
So the granularity is again changed too.
That's cool. Yeah. No, it makes sense, right? It's a different type of mentality, different scale. And yeah, how do you see the adoption of K8s at the moment? Because obviously certain people will say one thing. I mean, I've seen it more and more. We get questions as a product strategy team in Veeam, and it was a big drive for us to try and work out where the adoption was coming, what the thirst for it was. Certainly, I see. It's funny. APJ as a region, and ANZ specifically, generally has led the way traditionally in terms of uptake of new technology trends. But I don't think it's happened for the Kubernetes space. I think, in fact, APJ and ANZ is lagging behind. I obviously know that it's strong within the Valley area, those developers that have come out of university in the last 3 to 4 years, because like we've said earlier, that's all they know. So where do you see it now? Where do you see it in the future? And how do you think the growth of backup and DR and mobility, portability is going to actually, follow that growth in the space?
So in terms of broader layouts, I would agree with you. I think APJ, that region, we see some traction, some pull from there, but not as much as I would have thought initially. EMEA has been very surprising to me. So the European, Western Europe, we see tremendous Kubernetes use on-prem and public clouds. We have a number of large customers there. Obviously, the US, we definitely see that too. And we have customers across a variety of continents today. But to go back to your earlier point, where I see things going, I believe the answer is still early days. We are in the hockey stick growth part of that curve there, where we're going to see a lot of growth in Kubernetes. And then we see data protection emerge as a critical day 2 need. So the way I think about it in terms of what people buy, they'll buy a Kubernetes distribution first, right? They'll buy a security solution for that and get the first initial successes, and which is the really way it should be staged, right? Do the white glove treatment, get your first successes you can show to senior management, convince other developers, have the system speak for itself. And then you start seeing more meaningful applications show up, right? The things that run Oracle and the things that have business critical data and your tier 1 apps. And those tend to be the second or third wave. And all of those come with data protection requirements in there. Yeah. And this period I talk about for some enterprises as short as 6 to 8 months, which is a blink of an eye when you talk about a large company scale. Yeah. We've seen the 10x growth also in 6 to 8 months for customers. We start off with 10 nodes and that 100 before the end of the year. So when we see that spectrum, we see, look, there's the initial adoption, initial successes, more meaningful apps show up, company bets the future in Kubernetes, data protection, disaster recovery becomes a big ask as soon as there's real data, but also because of how large, complex environments work when you have 100 development teams, you're also seeing an increased ask for backup of stateless applications. We didn't think there was going to be that big of an ask, but we're seeing that from a number of companies right now. Yeah. And is that driven by the what you've talked about before and how Kasten does its thing? It's just driven by the fact that you know the artifacts, you know what makes up that application. So regardless if it's stateful or not, someone still at some point could make a mistake. And that, regardless of whether you've got data that's sitting there, in a stateful way, you need to be able to bring that application back to where it was. That's kind of where that comes from, right? Yeah. That is true. And here's the thing, when we talk about failure at scale, we're generally thinking infrastructure failure. This disk will fail, this server will fail. What we're discovering is that, as things have shifted upwards, my CI/CD pipeline has failed, or that Jenkins instance failed, or this, place where source code resided because it's using GitOps failed. And then how do you bring stuff back up becomes a question. So it's not just your traditional failure of data. Yes, we handle that, but when other systems fail that were responsible for deploying an app, right? What's your escape valve there? How do you quickly reset to what it needs to be? Is what customers are running into as Kubernetes scale grows for them.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. So we'll just start to wrap up, and we could talk for hours and hours, and it would be great. But obviously, we want to try and keep it in that 40-minute session. But just a couple of questions to end. So obviously, you guys are extremely innovative in the space. You saw the market, you took it. But how did you disrupt that market initially? What made Kasten stand out initially in this cloud native world, which is fluid? There's thousands. One of my favorite slides to show, Niraj, is that cloud native world, that PDF with literally thousands and thousands.
That landscape, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you guys are there. You guys are in that particular one. Mm-hmm. But that's just the reality of this ecosystem. It's fluid. It's not set yet. It hasn't really matured. How did you disrupt and become meaningful within that cloud native space?
I think one was from the technology perspective. The way we disrupted it was we never focused on competitors, but we said, what's the right solution to build in this space versus retrofitting something to exist or taking the old way of doing things and applying it here. So what's a green slate solution? So technology. Ease of use was the next biggest thing that I think was responsible for our success.
Yeah.
That is, Kubernetes is complex and developers, love to go underneath the hood. But when you need, from the ops perspective, when you need to manage a complex system at scale, taking pain out, right, was the next biggest thing, right? And obviously technical features and these, widgets here and the features there that contribute to that. I think at the top level, it's the right way of doing backup and recovery and doing the right way in an extremely easy to use manner. Really contributed to our success.
And I can actually attest to that, me just playing around with Kasten over the last few weeks or whatever, is that once you work out the deployment, especially if you're on-prem again, I'll tell you again, that's a big headache. But once you get over it, once Kasten loads and once you get into that dashboard, from my perspective, it becomes super easy. And I think that's actually, you're right, where you guys have been able to succeed is the fact that once the dashboard's up and running, you can be protecting those Kubernetes workloads within seconds, right? So that's a great part. So I totally agree with that. And with that now that you kind of set yourselves up, obviously the Veeam acquisition gives you some leverage in terms of dev and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But how are you looking to continually innovate internally and disrupt yourselves internally now moving forward?
It's a good question, right? And the way that at least I'm thinking about this right now is we focused on what in the cloud native space we call day two. Day one is installing Kubernetes, installing ingress, all the hard things you talked about that takes a while, right? And for just general applications. But now that's been simplified, the market's moved on. You talk about VMware, Tanzu, Kubernetes Grid, that makes it easier to do. Day two is running these things at scale in production, right? I think the next disruption is all these day two things. We talk about security, we talk about protection, we talk about backup, DR. How do you move all those things all the way over to day zero? Right? And by day zero, I mean when the first line of code is written or before the first line of code is written. How do you integrate this tightly, right? How do you do it in a way that protection is something that comes with your application as soon as you do the equivalent of hello world scaffolding and build it out from there. And that's really, I think, what we need to focus on. It's not, we see early customers adopting this, especially people that have a compliance and DevSecOps perspective.
Yeah.
So we actually have a customer speaking about this at KubeCon in a week or two.
Yeah.
And I think that day zero stuff is going to be critical to also get right. And then satisfy that entire spectrum. So when we talk about disrupting ourselves, we focus on day two. How are we going to go all the way back to day zero and service the needs of developers, of operators in that environment is going to be very important to us.
Interesting. I understand. I understand what you're getting at there. Adding some more awareness, some more control, end-to-end, policy-based. So that's awesome. All right, so let's wrap up. It's been a great conversation. Like I've been enthralled just listening to you talk about this space. You've obviously your background, your thought leadership in this area is amazing. So I could talk to you for hours, and our listeners could talk to you and listen to you for hours as well. Just in terms of Kasten itself, I know that you guys obviously have a free edition. Kasten.io, you can download, or you can actually, not really download, is it? You can apply it in the marketplaces on the clouds. You use Helm to deploy it. So it's basically such an easy install once you get your head around the Helm. But just talk a little bit about the free instances and what that actually means in a Kubernetes world. It's different to when Veeam says free for 10 VMs or instances, it's different. So what are you guys offering in that free version?
So, right, there's open source side of things, right? We have our open source projects, things that we contribute to, right? Which is obviously free to use, develop, integrate into your products. And then there's the commercial product that is also forever free, right? So we have a starter edition for us. That means up to 10 nodes. It can be the beefiest nodes you could buy in the market and run as many applications as you want on top of it.
Okay, so it's node based. Okay, that's good to know.
It is node-based, yeah. So as much storage, as many backups as you want. We do not meter or bill anything or restrict on top of that.
Yeah.
Right? So go for it. Download the platform. There's no gated downloads whatsoever. Right? You run a single command. It's up and running in your cluster. So you never need to register. Give us your email, your contact info. Right? And so you can use it. And if it works for you, we would be extremely happy. Just send us feedback. If you want to see if a user wants to see something different. But really, it's there for the community to use in production, in home labs, whatever you want.
Awesome. That's good stuff. And I'd highly suggest that if you guys, even if you're new to Kubernetes containerization, I think actually installing K10 and instead of doing a get nodes, why not just install Kasten? Because I think that will teach you a lot in itself, right? And that's kind of the beauty of it. I've certainly become better at my Kubernetes feng shui because of Kasten. So thank you for that as well. So that's awesome, Raj. Thank you very much. Let's wrap up. So you can find the show notes. I'm going to list, Kasten's details, the website, a bit about Niraj on there. You can find me at Anthony Spiteri on Twitter. We've got at GTWGT Podcast on Twitter, gtwgt.com. Again, please subscribe if you want to hear past episodes and future episodes. And with that, thank you, Niraj. Thank you to Kasten, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much again for having me.
No worries, mate. All right. Recording.